Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining our roundtable discussion, Black Women Speak, Charting Our Journeys in British Publishing. My name is Jade Bentel, and as well as being the chair for this afternoon's session, I am also a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford. My research explores the histories of Black feminist activism in post-war Britain. Alongside my doctoral research, I'm currently writing my first book, Rebel Citizen, which is a project that combines oral history, archival research, photography, Black feminist theory, and speculative writing to document African and Caribbean women's long histories of rebellion, refusal, and resistance in post-war Britain. Since I entered into the world of publishing a little under 2 years ago, I've had to navigate the particular forms of misogynoir that Black women writers have long been subjected to within the publishing industry. Much like academia, publishing seems to thrive on a structure of mystification, which is really the ongoing ways in which white gatekeepers decide what forms of knowledge production matter and who is allowed to have the necessary resources to undertake and publish their work. Each of the women who form part of the roundtable discussion today have been foundational for me in getting to grips with the arena of publishing in the UK. As they have gone on to do path-breaking, brilliant things in the publishing industry, they have also always included me along the way and so many other Black women along the way in their journeys. These forms of friendship, love, and support fundamentally challenge the individualistic, neoliberal demands of the machinery of the British publishing industry. Before we begin today's conversation, I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge that as 5 Black women taking part in the discussion today, we are all navigating the overwhelming matrix of globalized anti-Blackness. So much of what we are discussing today is tied to a system in which our lives are rendered disposable. In the wake of the Derek Chauvin verdict yesterday, 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant was killed by police in Ohio. Today and all days, I'm thinking about the ways in which the lives of Black women and girls in particular are made precarious throughout the world, and how in the midst of our deaths, we commune together and we care for each other. As we grieve and attend to the lives of those who should still be here, I want to hold space for all of the Black people who may be watching today, and Marianne, Theophina, Melissa, and Natalie, who have shown up today, even as we continue to mourn. So I'm going to begin today's session first by introducing each of the speakers and then inviting them each to speak for a few minutes on their work and interests within the publishing industry. So to begin with Black Girls Book Club, Melissa Cummings-Quarry and Natalie A. Carter met at secondary school in Northeast London and bonded over their shared love of books. Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God and Alice Walker's The Colour Purple remain firm favourites. Years later, Melissa, now a business development manager, and Natalie, a real estate manager, decided to channel that passion for reading and form the Black Girls Book Club, a literature and social events platform that celebrates literature by Black female writers. Now touted as one of the UK's top live literature events, Black Girls Book Club have hosted Roxane Gay, Mallory Blackman, Afua Hirsch, Tiari Jones, Angie Thomas, and featured in media such as Vogue, Stylist, BBC Radio, BuzzFeed, Metro, Gal Them, Pride, and more. Melissa and Natalie were named as 2 of the Bookseller's Rising Stars of 2019. Their debut book, Grown, will be published by Bloomsbury in 2021. So warm welcome to Melissa and Natalie. Next, I want to welcome Marianne Tatepo. Marianne is commissioning editor for Ebury Press and Pop Press at Penguin Random House UK, where she publishes lifestyle and illustrated nonfiction books. She was previously at Penguin General, Penguin Random House, and Fourth Estate and William Collins at HarperCollins. Marianne has an MA in publishing from UCL and a BA in comparative literature and film studies from King's College London. She is the founder of Black Agents and Editors Group, BAE, and was recently listed as 150 most influential in publishing by the Bookseller. So warm welcome to Marianne this afternoon. And last, but certainly not least, is Theophina Gabriel. Theophina is a creative, award-winning published poet and freelance writer and artist from Slough. She studied philosophy and theology at the University of Oxford, and after graduating in 2019, she worked at Penguin Random House within Stormzy's imprint, #Murky Books, before leaving to pursue her freelance career. In 2018, she founded her independent publication Onyx Magazine, a multi-award-winning creative independence arts magazine dedicated to platforming and publishing Black poets, writers, and artists. 1,000 copies of Onyx were printed in its first run, and since, the magazine has been distributed across universities throughout the UK and internationally as well as being invited to 10 Downing Street and the Houses of Parliament for government consultation on inclusion within the creative industry. So hello to everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Before I hand over the floor for each of you to kind of introduce yourselves and speak a bit more about your interests, I do just want to encourage, everyone watching to please, throughout the conversation that we're having, feel free to submit your questions within the Q&A box. Please do keep them concise so that I can read them out with ease, and we will get to those later in the discussion. So to begin, I'm going to kind of hand over to both Melissa and Natalie to talk a bit more about Black Girls Book Club and all of the wonderful things that you guys have been doing since 2016.
Oh, thank you so much. You know what? It's so lovely to be on a stage with other Black women and also to kind of be honoured in the way that you kind of spoke about us and all of our achievements. Because we know Marianne, we know Theophina, but it's very rare that people actually take the time to just break down what people do. People kind of know the face, they know the name, but people don't really realise kind of the work that people are doing behind the scenes to kind of create a space for Black women and for writers. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say just to start. But yeah, we are Black Girls Book Club. So Nats, do you want me to go first? I can see it in your face. Should I go? Yeah. So in terms of what we do and kind of our interests, Natty and I we've been best friends for a very, very long time. And it was super important for us to start something that was kind of not only just a manifestation of our friendship, but kind of speaking to what we knew was needed. It's quite interesting that we're kind of on a panel in terms of publishing, because we've never really seen ourselves as being part of publishing in that way. We've always been on the fringes. We've always kind of worked really hard and quite distinctively to ensure that there is space and a place for other Black women to kind of thrive. And I think the fact that we didn't really kind of integrate or work with publishers in kind of a traditional sense meant that we had ownership over what we were doing. You know, we were able to chart a path. And I feel that perhaps maybe if we had kind of opened up that space and allowed publishers to come in, the way in which Black Girls Book Club kind of is now, and the way that you see us, and would be very, very, very different. I think we didn't really look to the trends. We didn't really look to see kind of what people were feeling at that point. At the time when we even came up with the name, Black Girls Book Club, we had so many comments from people asking why. So can you imagine now it's Black girl everything, Black girl magic, black girl here all day everything, and back then it was a struggle. It was a fight to say it's for Black women. We're not going to call it caramel sauce sugar book club or whatever. We're going to keep it very real. It's for Black women. Why lie? And not because this space isn't for anybody else, but more so because we wanted Black women to know that they were included. And at every step, every turn, everything that we were doing was with them in mind. And I think for me, I believe that comes through, and I think that's why we've been so successful. I think a lot of people who just see us think we're just a book club, but we do a little bit more than that. And I think Natalie will tell you exactly what we do. Because we don't just read books,
What do? We don't just read books. We read books. We go on Caribbean trips. We throw raves. We take over Parliament.
You see, just fit that in. We just take over Parliament.
There's so many things
festivals.
We do festivals. We do movie nights where we screen like classic Black films. Remember we did that screening of Girlfriends before it was on Netflix. That was some of the first times that people in the UK who didn't have cable were able to watch Netflix. That was epic as well. I mean, I don't really have much more to add to what Melissa said, because I think she encapsulates it perfectly. I think it started from our love of books and just love of Black women and love of one another. And I think I had also struggled always personally in my journey because, I always wanted to read books about Black girls and read books about Black women. That's why I ended up reading not nonsense, but madness that like 13-year-olds shouldn't be watching, like Waiting to Excel. I read that book the other day, and then I went to meet Mel for lunch, and I was like, what was I doing reading this book at 13 years old? I shouldn't really be reading those other Eric Jerome Dickey, passionate love stories, but I just wanted to read a book with a Black woman on the cover that was about a Black woman who looked like me, felt like me, and even if she was African American, kind of reminded me of myself. So when we kind of came up with the idea for Black Girls Book Club, I jumped all over it because I was like, finally, I'm going to meet all these people that love reading books about Black women. And I feel like if it wasn't for Black Girls Book Club, I don't even know if I would be as well read as I am now, because as soon as you meet someone, they're like, have you read this? Or have you read that? Have you read this? And then you've got this whole long list of all these classics that you need to read beyond just like my favorite book, The Color Purple, Their Eyes Were Watching God, or I Know Where the Cage Bird Sings. There's such a plethora of publishing from Black women in the UK as well as in the US. And so Black Girls Book Club has really opened my eyes to what I've been missing, and I'm still not satisfied, and there's still more for me to read. You know, I'm still coming up to the literary Black buffet and taking seconds and taking thirds and fourths, and I'm not full. So, you know, what can I say?
It's so true. Do you know what? It's so true. I think it's so quickly we went from kind of doing booze and brunch and just wanting to do up enjoyment, having fun, to saying we're coming here to decolonize the bookshelf. You know, this is on. I think when you're on the fringes and you can see what is happening, I think, within the industry and how perhaps writers are treated and how, you know, publishing professionals are treated. Look, Marianne, I'm sure will go into a bit more detail than we have kind of the scope to do, but I will say that there is something to be said for kind of owning your own brand and being able to direct your own your vision and do what you think needs to be done. No one can tell us how to cater to Black women. You know, we are Black women, we do that well. And I think, and as Natalie said, she picked up on a really important point. We hosted this movie night for girlfriends, was it about 2 years ago now? Before
2019, definitely,
right? Yeah, I think it might even have been before that, but that was before Netflix even thought to put that on screen. And I think one thing I'll say, and it's not even just to our own horn, but I think it's more so because we're so switched into what Black women are wanting and what Black readers are needing, is we're always ahead of the curve. You know, we're always one step before it. So when people say, how did you get Roxane Gay? How did you get Tayari Jones? Why is Mariah Carey calling you out? And, you know, how are you getting all of these things? Like, because we're doing the work and we're seeing the vision. We're not waiting for somebody else to do it. You know, we're not monitoring and watching what people are doing and trying to repackage it and refashion it. This is us. This is real. So yeah, like publishing is a mad world. That's what I'll say.
Yeah.
Because, you know, Jade and I have conversations about this. It's a mad world. I'm just happy to be up here with my best friend, living my life, because God knows how I would have survived if it was just me by myself. I love publishing. I love books. I love everything about it. But I cannot imagine what it means to be a Black woman in that space. And corporate world, as hard as it is, I don't know how you guys survive.
Yeah, and I think it's just to add on to that, it's like as you meet more people and they begin to show you more classics and more Black British women who publish phenomenal stories. Like I go on Amazon and pay $24.99 because there's only like 5 left in print. And then I'm like, how was this book not a #1 bestseller? How was this book not phenomenal? I'm not even going to drop names because I don't know what people are working on. I don't want to blow up the thing. But certain books I'll read and then I'll buy a copy from Melissa and be like, how could we not know about this book? Someone wrote this book and the story is based in Stoke Newington and I can catch the bus there and nobody knows about it. And so when we kind of see news about new books being published and Black authoresses, as we call them, being given some shine, I just hope that we will actually turn back and see that we've got some classics that we need to bring back into the Sunday Times bestseller list, if I'm honest.
Yeah, that's our next mission.
Yeah. I've got a list, don't worry, don't watch me. I've got a list. I'm not even
joking. But yeah, guys, that's us. We are Black Girls Book Club. As we say, our main mission in this life is to ensure that Black women and girls have all of the things, they have all the things that they need to be truly phenomenal. And we work tirelessly to do so.
Yeah, we do.
No, also, we wrote a book as well. Forgot about that.
Oh, yeah, sorry, my bad.
We wrote a book. And the Black Girls Guide Growing Up. And again, it's a manifestation of all of the things that we've learned along the way. And really, if you've ever been to a book club event or brunch or anything we've done, I think this is kind of what you expect from us. And yeah, and we have some features, some very nice friends. You might have heard of them.
Really? Who? No, joking.
you.
I am so excited for your book. I just know it's going to be an event.
Wow.
You guys don't do things by halves, and why should you? So I'm just so excited for September to come. You know, as you guys were talking, I was actually thinking of the first like Black girls book club event that I went to, and the funniest thing is the first Black girls book club event that I went to was the holiday in Tobago. You guys through. So this is, you know, Black Girls Book Club, as you keep on saying, it's an experience. Like, the, you know, you guys are kind of doing things across the board. I remember someone kind of sending me this kind of holiday link saying, oh, you know, Black Girls Book Club, you love to read, like, you know, Black women, you love to go on holiday, you love enjoyment, which is very true. So, you know, you should kind of sign up for this. I was like, yeah, I mean, I've never met them, I've never been to any of the UK events, but I'll meet them at the airport and we can have a good time.
And sis, we
like,
did. Did we not enjoy?
we had a great time. But it was like literally halfway through the holiday that someone turned to me. They were like, have you actually ever been to a Black Girls Book Club event? I was like, no.
I was trying to find you because when Jade, the travel operator, she was like, do you know like this? I was like, I don't know this girl. And we were messaging.
We were like looking through Eventbrite and everything.
We went through every single like attendee list. We're like, we don't know who she is. Where did she come from? And for me, that I guess for me, that was kind of, you know what, we're doing our work, we're doing our job. If somebody can see what we're doing as two friends and they're like, you know what, I'll spend my money, I'll get on this flight and I know that I'm going to be safe, I know I'm going to enjoy, I know they're going to love me, they're going to take care of me, then we've done the work. So yeah, for me, I think when Jade came, I think that was kind of that trigger point was actually, yeah, we could write a book, and actually, yeah, we could do a festival, and actually, yeah, we could do all of these things. We can think big, you know? So I actually want to say thank you to Jade for, because for me, that moment was like, yeah, we're doing it right.
Thank you to you both. Like, you know, just having that space, knowing that I could, like, you know, be welcomed into this group of Black women who I didn't know from anywhere, and just kind of form these like lifelong friendships, you know, has been absolutely life-changing. So thank you. I am going to move on and ask Marianne to kind of like step up to the podium and speak a bit more about her work and interests.
Hi, so it's great to be in your company. I'm glad that we're in a room together, even if we're all in different rooms, and we can bring our range of expertise to the table. So my background is that I am on the publishing side in-house at Penguin Random House. I've been there for a little bit over 2 years, about 2.5 years. And as you mentioned, Jade, before that, I was at HarperCollins for a couple of years as well. My current role as commissioning editor at Ebury means that I work on nonfiction. As you mentioned, my focus is illustrated nonfiction, but I do a little bit of kind of short narrative nonfiction. Those are kind of taxonomies and systems that I could dive further into, but I won't too much. All I will say is what I'm looking to do with the books that I'm working on is to essentially, so on the lifestyle side of things, focus on kind of creative or, you know, kind of solutions and things that people can adopt in their own lives, whether it's cookbooks, food and drink stuff where they can cook different cuisines than the ones that they're used to, or come up with, you know, quicker ways to cook and new techniques, or if it's kind of well-being and it's a new way of understanding well-being and mental health and wellness. And I also work on kind of gift and humor, and you know, there's a range of things actually, which is really exciting for me. Occasionally it can be kind of environmental stuff, nature, design. So yeah, there's really a lot of scope. And you know, as part of that, I really think that we should be catering to a range of audiences. And obviously one of the audiences I feel that I know best and understand best is Black women, is Black people. So in my commissioning so far, just to kind of, yeah, update everybody in the room about what I'm working on. I've got, actually the first book coming out is by someone called Dr. Olivia Reams. She's a mental health researcher at the University of Cambridge, and she's done a few TED Talks, and it's all about kind of mental health. And the amazing thing about her is she's very good at conveying that information with brevity. A lot of the time when you're reading books about mental health, and especially neuroscience, you have to get through 400 pages. But when you're very on edge and unwell, you do not have the bandwidth to get through 400 pages. So her book is kind of a really short and nice and sweet summary of all of that. And yeah, so it's important for me to have a kind of general reader title like that one on the list. And well-being is a really big thing for me. But I think within the well-being space, what excites me in my job is that it feels like we are not being catered for at the minute. So another book that's coming out in kind of, I think it's in June now, so it's a couple of months' time, that I'm working on is Living While Black by Gwen Kinwani, who's a psychologist, a radical psychologist and anti-racist educator. And that's actually the first book that I got to acquire at Ebury, which I joined a year ago. The book is special because it's a deep dive into kind of the psychology of race and racism. It is a book about, how trauma affects essentially the mind, the body, and so on. And it addresses the Black reader. And that's something I hadn't necessarily experienced. I felt like there are a lot of really important foundational books out there that, acknowledge and analyze the Black experience, if you can call it that, the Black experiences, really. But I didn't feel that I could find books that actually just unabashedly decided to address Black readers directly. And there was always that white gaze in the way. And here we flip that on its head. The reader, the kind of key reader, is a Black person of whatever gender. And if you're an ally, you can pick it up and you will learn a lot as well. So that's who we're centering with that one. It's a really kind of powerful book. And then another kind of couple of books coming out later this year are, trying to remember my timeline. So actually, I think the following one is Misfits, a Personal Manifesto by Michaela Cole, which we announced on Monday. So it's the debut by Michaela Cole, which is a very exciting acquisition, which they'll be coming out on the 7th of September in the UK and the US. And we kind of acquired that through an exclusive deal I did. And we've also got Hill House Living by stylist Paula Sutton coming out in October. Yes, Auntie Paula, who's an absolute delight. So I'm sure you can hear it from the range of things I've mentioned so far in terms of my commissioning, but I am working on a number of books for different readers and different types of kind of tastes, I suppose. And all of them, for me, the important thing is all of them should have popular appeal, a kind of mass market appeal, and be really accessible. So actually, Jade, thinking back to what you were saying at the beginning, this thing about our industries loving to mystify things, that's the opposite of what I'm about. I love going to Black Girls Book Club and being challenged and made to engage with books in a critical way. But I also know that sometimes I just need it, give it to me straight, especially with my nonfiction. And nonfiction tends to try and be wayward and to make you feel like you're not worthy occasionally, even that you have to try harder rather than kind of connecting you with the text and the author. So I think that's at the center of everything that I do in my commissioning. And about a year ago, off the back of, again, you mentioned this at the beginning, Jade, but just the completely arresting and depressing situation we're in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, which I'm now allowed to use the word murder, which I wasn't before. So I'm grateful for being able to acknowledge that. I created a community called BAE, and that stands for Black Agents and Editors Group. It's a community for people in the book industry. Primarily at the minute, we're focused on agents and editors, although we have had a few socials with people from other kind of departments. And we also have a mentor network that we've been building up, which is all about kind of demystifying our industry for newcomers who are curious about publishing. And through that, again, I keep on repeating this, but it is a community. But through that community, we've been able to, we've got a website up and running. We curated an issue of the Bookseller called The Black Issue, which came out a couple of weeks ago, and that was a fully Black issue of the trade magazine, The Bookseller, which is essentially a publication for the publishing industry. And as per its name, a lot of booksellers refer to it when they're thinking of what to stock. So that's kind of the idea behind it, but it's also for us a big media outlet for all book news. The magazine was founded in 1858. There had never been any guest editor, so I was the first ever guest editor of any description. So that's kind of my broad kind of remit, I guess. And yeah, I'm pleased to be in all of your company. As I said earlier, I think I like the range of things that we do. I think often something I want to mention just in passing is there's an expectation that we should just be doing the highbrow, the literary fiction, the this, the that, and actually there should be range. I'm very happy to be kind of working on a range of books. I'm very happy that even though my background has been nonfiction, I'm now doing books that are so much more accessible than maybe where I started. And yeah, I think we need to not be viewed as a monolith. So I'm hoping to contribute to that through my work.
Thank you so much, Marianne. I mean, just watching the past few weeks of your life from the sidelines has been just completely amazing. You know, you're doing incredible things. What I really love about, you know, the range of work that you're publishing, like you said, is that, you know, there's something for everyone. So it's just beautiful to see. And I'm also reminded, actually, as we're talking, that I also actually met you at a Black Girls Book Club event. We were having a little dinner with Saidia Hartman. Theophina was there as well. So
yes.
This is kind of like a beauty. And I think that was like, you know, that was September 2019. And that was kind of like one of the final events that was kind of like going before the world kind of like exploded. So I think this is the first time we're kind of like all reconvening in one sort of space, albeit virtually. So yeah, it's just really, really exciting and beautiful. All right, I am going to hand over now to Theophina for what will be a really beautiful presentation. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Jade. And just to echo everything that everyone said so far, it's just so lovely to be in a space with other women in industry who have like just the love of books as a fundamental basis in their lives. It's just really special and powerful. So I'm not going to use my 5 minutes to talk about myself. I decided to do this little presentation that really tries to delve into charting Black British women's histories in publishing. So I've got a PowerPoint presentation, which hopefully they're going to show now, and I'm just going to whiz through it. And hopefully by the end, we'll have a bit more understanding about the legacy of Black British women's history within publishing. So my name is Theophina. I am a poet, I'm a writer, an artist, and also I'm the editor-in-chief of Onyx magazine, which is my award-winning independent publication dedicated to publishing Black poets, writers, and artists. And yeah, so in response to the panel topic, I just wanted to chart the appearance of Black women in Britain in publishing. And it's kind of ambitious, but I'm going to aim to sort of take us from the 18th century all the way up to sort of our prominence in the 1960s, going through to the Middle Passage in the 1980s, our rise to prominence, and finally just a commercial snapshot of where Black women are in industry currently. So if I say currently, sort of from 2012 to where we are now. So if we could go to our first slide, please. So the beginning. So we start off with the first Black woman to ever be published in Britain, and her name was Phyllis Wheatley. So the first Black woman to be published in Britain was actually American, and she published a pamphlet of poetry in 1773. She was brought over by her slave masters at the time because they actually thought the British publishing industry would be more viable to publish her poetry pamphlet. And that's something that comes up as a pattern later on within industry, sort of the favoring of the American voice. But if we just kind of skip forward, we kind of see that Black women aren't really, and Black British women are really missing in these years between the 18th century, and there's no points for guessing why. We were in bondage, and we do sort of break through in the 1930s, but that's more of our men counterparts, our men literary counterparts. So what would happen in the 1930s, we started to have more ties with the colonial publishing industry. So we'd see names like George Lamming and Stuart Hall and Samuel Selvin, and the connection with empire was that they would come from the colonial subservient countries over to study in the UK and then pursue literary careers in London. Unfortunately, because of the intersections that Black women face, we were not with our male literary counterparts. We were sort of held back in terms of educational privileges and autonomy to travel. But what we see with the Windrush era is the real literary and industry foremothers who carved out a space for Black British women voices. And so Margaret Busby, who co-founded Allison and Busby in 1967, was the first Black woman publisher in the UK. And she was followed by Jessica Huntley, who co-founded Bogle and Louverture in 1969, which was a Black radical press. And she co-founded that with her husband. And so what we kind of see is the carving out of space in the infrastructure by Black women for Black women. And that is another theme that continues to arise as we chart our way through to the Middle Passage. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what we see in the Middle Passage is really the fruits of the labor of Busby, of Huntley, of all of these independent publishers. And it's really interesting to note that all of this canon was happening outside of the traditional infrastructures, simply because Black British women were rendered invisible to traditional publishing in favor of their American counterparts. And Margaret Busby actually calls it the unification of the diasporic voice. British publishers felt that American women just did it better. Famously, Virago told a Black British woman writer that she didn't have enough expertise on Black womanhood to be published, and went on to publish Maya Angelou. And so what we see is sort of the stripping of the autonomy of Black British women's voices in favor of their American counterparts. So, I mean, we can see in terms of commercial success, Toni Morrison against Buchi Mcheta, Maya Angelou against Patience Agbabi, and Alice Walker against Jean Binta Breeze. And this really feeds into the narrative of the devaluation of Black British women writers historically by the industry, because they simply can't take apart the nuance of our experiences. And so the common sort of thread was one voice can speak for all voices, and these voices were predominantly American. But this is traditional, and it's really important to say that there was a lot of self-determination coming up through independent presses, a real revitalization of community spaces that were publishing and creating safe spaces for Black British women. So we had Black British women being published. It's just that the commercial and traditional success that we can see with their American counterparts were denied to them. This does not make them any less worthy. Black British women have always been writing. These are Black British women like Buchi, who I mentioned, Beryl Gilroy, Faruka Dondi, and anthologies were a really popular way of just gathering all of the Black British women into one place and really just pushing the prominence of their voices. So we had the popularity of anthologies like Heart of the Race, which was obviously published in 1987, and Daughters of Africa, which was published later through Allison and Bubsy in 1992. But the industry, for all intents and purposes, were very much missing in the autonomy of carving these voices and uplifting Black women through their rise into visibility within the 1980s. And so our legacy really is with independent publishers and independent publishing houses, New Beacon, and we have carved out our ways or found ways to operate outside of the infrastructure when our value has been denied within it. So if we move on to our current course, so I've made a little chart for us, and it's basically charting from 2012 up until now, the Black women in the top 500 spots by sales in UK publishing. And this is across adult fiction and nonfiction. And I find it so interesting. Like I'm that person. I love going through Excel and like looking at the sales figures and just seeing like, oh, that book did really well, or that book didn't do as well as we thought it would, and trying to see why. So as we can see, from 2012 to 2013, Black British women are very present in terms of in comparison to their American counterparts, but we are still sort of out of 500 spots, we're kind of 2 apiece. And then it's really interesting to see the effects of trends on this commercial sort of snapshot. So for example, in 2013, with the resurgence of attention around the Black Lives Matter movement in America, in 2014, we see Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's We Should All Be Feminists rise to prominence and actually be the only book to hit commercial success in 2014, and Black British women's voices are notoriously missing. In 2015, we get a little bit of resurgence with Black British women breaking into the top 500 spots mainstream. But again, it shows that the sustainability of publishing within trends is not at all feasible. By 2016, there are no Black women in mainstream commercial spots. Now in 2017, we start to see Zadie Smith and Dorothy Koomson break through. And what happens from here is really interesting, and it's something to note about the industry. Comparison titles and sort of having frameworks to build pricing and costings of really open the doors for Black British women writers within traditional publishing. So with Dorothy Koomson's success, with Zadie Smith's success, we gradually start to see, not so much for our American counterparts, but for Black British women, a gradual rise. And I'm hoping this is not only to do with the success of these commercial authors, but also the changes that are happening within the traditional industry. So Marianne, prime example, people like you on the inside who are no longer gatekeeping the infrastructure and actually allowing the Black British voices to flourish within commercial metrics and frameworks. So if we could go to our last slide, this is just a bit about my thoughts about the journey ahead. So we've come a long way. We were pretty much seen as invisible by the industry, and now we have announcements of Farida Abike-Imide with 6- and 7-figure book deals. We also have seen the commercial success of Queenie, and Marianne's most recent acquisition announced recently with Michaela Cowell. And what I'm hoping that this signals to the industry is something that we've already known, that Black British women writers' stories have always been present, they've always been valuable. It's just getting us into the commercial arena so that we can operate and have our voices heard, flourished, and published authentically by Black British women on the inside, who again continue the legacy of Margaret Busby and Huntley, of Black women carving out spaces for other Black women to come through and flourish. So that's just a short snapshot, a short overview of our journey. And I hope that these successes just breed more comparisons for us to see more Black women and Black British women thrive within the industry. Thank you.
Hi, sorry, my internet connection kind of like dropped off towards the end there, but thank you so much, Theophina, for such a beautiful presentation. As a historian, just being able to kind of, see the kind of, legacy of Black women in Britain working in publishing, and just kind of different trajectories that have shaped where we are at now, with Mel and Natalie about to kind of like publish their first book, me in the process of kind of trying to write it. It's always good to be reminded of the kind of, the historical kind of foundations of our kind of like current context. Just a quick question, is my internet okay now? It's still kind of like moving a bit slow on my end, so I just wanted to make sure that you can all kind of hear me. Okay, cool. I'm going to ask you a question, then I'm probably going to try and work that out really quickly. So just to kind of like begin I did just kind of want to ask you each, what are, I know you've kind of each touched on it in your presentations and talks, but what are the barriers faced by, Black women in publishing? And by Black women in publishing, I mean both, Black women editors, Black women working in marketing, sales team, etc., as well as Black women authors.
I want to point my finger at someone who wrote a piece about this for the Black issue.
So yes, and it was wonderfully edited by Marianne. So I could easily point the finger back, but I'm not going to. I'll take it. I think that in the most recent issue of the Bookseller, I wrote an article about the concrete ceilings, which was a wonderful concept introduced to me by Marianne about the intersectionality of bias that Black women face within the industry. And so when we talk about barriers that that Black British women face within industry, I definitely think that the sort of history of exclusion within these traditional spheres really rob us of a sort of blueprint of success to model ourselves out of. We don't see that many Black British women in commissioning positions usually, and so what we see is a lot of entry-level talent, and it's difficult because these decision makers usually come from higher up within the acquisition process. So it's a lot of sort of trying to, you know, relate the marketability of a certain book to more senior positions who then historically haven't seen anything succeed in ways that we know that they can. And so it really is a barrier to even get to a space where the barrier can be shifted oftentimes. And the concrete ceiling definitely applies to Black women. The glass ceiling, as we've all heard of in this sort of analogy, only applies to white women who are held back on the basis of their gender, whereas Black women face racial bias, we face stereotyping, we face a whole host of barriers and setbacks that we have to navigate before we even get to gender. So, I mean, in terms of breaking through, for Black women in industry, I definitely think that it's looking at the examples of Marianne who are really making history as we speak, so to speak, because the next wave of Black editors coming up will have these spaces and infrastructures that are really recently being brought into existence, Bay being one example of them. And in terms of authors, I definitely feel like it happens in cycles. We come to prominence. I think the main barrier for Black British women who are authors is the commodification and the sort of being used as a trend. When the time is right, we see this anti-racism genre pop up its head, and then we disappear for another, you know, how many years. But I definitely feel like that again is kind of phased out when we bring forward editors who understand the importance and the authenticity of Black British women writing. But it all comes with sort of getting our foot through the door, which is the first battle and the first barrier.
Yeah, and to just touch upon what you've brilliantly illustrated, and obviously you've been through that journey yourself. What I didn't really address in my little introductory bit earlier is, I mean, it's a fluke, but you can hear it, that I'm not British. I mean, I know that we're at the Rothermere American Institute. I'm also not American. I was born and bred in Brussels, Belgium, and this is only relevant insofar I've been here for 11 years. So, you know, I've lived kind of my whole adult life here since the end of my teens. So as far as an implant goes, I've been, you know, this is where I've made a life, really. But I think for me, I would emphasize that there's the context of I am from Cameroon. That's where my family's from, different parts of Cameroon, both my parents. We are part of the Commonwealth. We were attacked by the British and so on and so forth. But there's that nuance there personally for me. And I think what that means is when you've come to another country and you've lived for a few years, you're already a little bit of an outsider. So I think I would say on a personal level, I'm so used to the idea of being a little bit of an outsider that I kind of sometimes accept it. And what I found very interesting historically is talking to friends who grew up in London from birth, and who were able to go to all Black schools and, you know, be centered in their environments and in their neighborhoods and so on. And I hear these stories of the culture shock. But I think having always been thrust in those environments where I was minoritized, I almost accepted it. It doesn't mean it's fine. It doesn't mean it's positive. It's just kind of being like, oh, of course I'm the alien here, and that's what I should expect. But I think what it means is maybe by being unfazed, I find that maybe as a double outsider in that sense, I noticed some things, you know, when you're observing a different culture, so to speak, you notice things that people who are used to it don't observe as well, conversely. And I think I feel fine pointing out things that surprise me or things that are weird to me. But I want to kind of mention the contributions of people who are Black British, born and bred, or for the most part who I've spoken to, because part of what I'm doing at Bay is making sure I'm facilitating what other people want to share and what they need. And so in the issue that we did with the Bookseller, two amazing agents spoke to me about some of their experiences. Emma Patterson, who actually represents Jade, and Nell Andrew. And some of the things they mentioned, I think, are really relevant to your question here. And Emma, for instance, mentioned, you know, she's a Black woman, she's a light-skinned kind of Black woman. And she mentioned that she's, you know, this is me, she didn't mention it. She's an agent at the top of her game. She's one of the very best. I'm saying this. She wouldn't say it, but I know it's true and I believe it. And she was finding that she was being asked to do panels around cultural appropriation, and then her colleagues were being asked to do panels around craft. So, you know, you hear these things and you hear these kind of shorthands about, we just need to plonk someone in there who's got a little bit of, you know, a little bit of spice to make sure that we have that covered almost. And if you're getting that when you're 10 years into your publishing career and journey, and you represent some of the biggest talent, such as Jade, such as Bernardine Evaristo, like what can you expect when you're lower down? I like that you're sipping the tea. Perfect timing, both of you. So that kind of gave me pause, and I think it's brilliantly illustrated by Emma. And Nell also mentioned kind of in a meeting with a quite senior publisher, hearing things like, oh, well, people of color don't read. So it's that funny kind of trickle down thing. Well, we're all in the room, aren't we? It's that funny trickle down thing of, if there's that belief that anyone who's not white, because whiteness is intellect, is power, is superiority. If anyone who's not white doesn't technically read, then you get the extra intersections adding up with kind of, you know, Blackness, with Black womanhood specifically, and with other, you know, marginalizations within society that we might have. So I think, yeah, it's a very complex issue. And I suppose the thing about that is, I believe that actually in terms of, well, actually I've read a number of things about publishing and why people thrive in publishing. And it's not all down to intellect. A lot of it is down to this idea of likability and this idea of being the right cultural fit, and this idea around, you know, who kind of elevates you, who champions you. And historically, white people have done well because they prop each other up, and they lift each other up, and they have these kind of inner circles. And this is kind of a prominent US former publisher who said this. It's not my theory, but there's structural reasons why the people who stay in publishing. So the idea with Bay is that we've now created this network. So currently it's about almost 60 members, and it's anything from a kind of informal conversation to career advice to, you know, maybe referencing or things like that, or, you know, prepping for job interviews. All of those things are readily available to a lot of people that I've encountered on my journey in publishing, who are often a niece of somebody, or a goddaughter or a godson, or whatever it might be. So structurally, because of the amazing timeline you've put together, we can now see why we aren't able to remain in those positions, even if we absolutely love them. So I think those are some of the big barriers. And again, going back to the concrete ceiling, if you add to that gendered expectations as well of, you know, being assertive and standing up for yourself, and I don't want to go into this, but we all know it, the angry Black woman and all of that. You actually, being assertive is not encouraged, and it's not, most of the time, it's not rewarded for Black women. So on the one hand, we have a need to be assertive and outspoken because that's how you get ahead. On the other hand, we tend to get penalized for the things that other people get rewarded for. So that's kind of my overview of you know, that whole situation. And I could go on about authors, but I think really good points have been made, and I'd like to hear from authors on that, to be honest.
Nasty, Melissa, do you have anything to say? I mean,
authors, you know what? I don't consider myself to be an author or authoress. I think for me, I go back to that. Natty and I have always remained on the fringes doing what we do. I think we've been very lucky that the position that we have with our platform is we have an insight into what's happening, you know, with editors and what's happening with agents and what's happening with PR, what's happening in marketing. We are very lucky to kind of see what's happening, you know, and kind of understanding how to navigate that. I think in my experience, and I don't actually think it's necessarily a publishing thing. I think publishing, and we've discussed this before, Jade, I think it's kind of like the last bastion of kind of a purely white space. I think if, you know, there are lots of industries where Black women and men have been quite successful, even if it's quite a small minority, like law, for example. But I think for me, publishing is incredibly white. So what you get with publishing is that they're not necessarily listening to Black women. And that's all it is. Just like any other industry, they're not listening to Black women. So because they're not listening, you then, you know, there are barriers that they're facing. But if someone just said, you know what, let's just trust what she's saying, you know, that's it. And that's it. I think there's lots of things that we can say. We can wax lyrical, this, that, and the other. But in all of the conversations I've had with friends in the industry, outside of the industry, authors, it's not listening to Black women and perhaps not thinking. I think, Marianne, you kind of tapped in on that with the idea, oh, Black people don't read. You know, not realizing what we do and how we function as a people, I think has been the barrier, not for us, but on the other side. And I think it was really interesting, Theophina, when we looked at the presentation you did, 2016, no books, Black women well in top 500. 2016 is when we decided to launch Black Girls Book Club.
I was thinking the same thing, but I didn't want to say it.
I've been told by people within the industry, allies, and one thing I will say actually in terms of the industry, allies have been very supportive in terms of helping us to understand how to operate as a business and a brand. And we have been told that us launching this platform was a trigger in terms of wanting to publish more Black British voices, understanding that there was a market for Black women, you know, in Black women and the different demographics in terms of who is reading books and who they can funnel the books to, but also understanding that actually if you put a book out by a Bernardine Evaristo or a Jade Bentel, that lots of people buy it if the promotion and the marketing is there. So this is why we go back to, we're not just a book club, because behind the scenes, we're doing a lot of work in terms of assisting brands and, you know, publishers in getting the books in the right places, but also kind of opening their eyes in terms of how you go about really promoting the work of Black women. Not everyday panels, you know, not every day let's go Waterstones, you know, not every day bookmark and tote bag. There's lots of things that can be done. And if Natalie and I can do it without any kind of publishing assistance or help with our own money, then, you know, the big traditional brands can do it too. I think on basis as authors, because I guess we're authors, we've done bits. I would say that we just do it, you know, we don't really tap into that kind of, I'm an author and this is my position, I'm just going to write and I'm going to give my book to my editor. It's what we do, it's kind of our livelihood. When we're writing fundamentally about Black womanhood and Black girlhood. Perhaps if we were writing about different subjects, we would have maybe a different experience, but when you're writing about yourself, I think it's quite, I don't know, I just feel like you're not really going to allow someone to put a barrier up. And I think someone said in the comments, you know, how do you smash the concrete barrier? What we do in Black Girls Book Club, if we open a door, just a crack, I'm going to kick it down, I'm bringing everybody in. And it's a reason why, you know, Jade will know Marianne and Jade will know Theophina, because we're bringing everybody in, and that's just what we do. If we get an opportunity, then we're going to ensure each and every single person gets one too. And I think, it's the idea of gatekeeping as well. I think it's a gatekeeping thing, I think, with publishing, but you guys are in it, so you know more than me.
And adding to that, actually, and I touched upon it a little bit earlier, but genuinely structurally, I mean, it feels like sometimes people throw around the word structurally, institutionally, but genuinely from that timeline that we saw. So when you hear about some literary agencies, they have all these initials and various I don't know, like consonants, that's because they're from the surnames of the founders. And that's genuinely, and many imprints as well, the oldest imprints, a lot of the time it's the name of a white man who maybe was a slave owner. Like that's genuinely the way it was. So when we talk about that kind of generational thing or institutional thing, that's why publishing, when you said, Melissa, oh, it's one of the last bastions of whiteness, that's genuinely why. They have the names of these men, and it's mostly men who did questionable things. And usually it was because they had the money that they could start that business. Generally, they could be like, oh, well, I will do that, and I will put my nephew there. That's just the structure of it. It is mostly, they've been family-owned businesses and family-run businesses. And then actually the women moved into publishing because these men needed secretaries or people to write notes for them. And they're like, fine, the women can come in. And they could get white women to do that kind of labor for them. And then the women were implanted there as kind of affordable labor, and also, you know, whatever kind of misogynistic things happened there. And then it ended up being kind of 85% female industry, but all the men are at the top because they're the initial investors. So actually that's a nuance that I often think back to when I'm like, wait, why is this way? There aren't any men, but a lot of them, when they are in, they're very senior and very important positions. But yeah, that is absolutely, to your point, like last bastion of whiteness, that is a structural kind of phenomenon, and there's history to it.
And just to riff off of what you're saying, what everyone's saying, and sort of bring it into like a lens, it's definitely to do with sort of the way that these structures perpetuate themselves. So we can see like the interest in Black British women's voices has just been missing from this industry because of who's commissioning from the inside, as we've seen. And so, as you said, Marianne, as we start to see more Black women in these positions, there's slight shifts in autonomy. We start to see these books appearing where before there wasn't really anything coming out. And one of the things that I think someone has asked is, would we be able to sort of comment on white people's tastes and interests in Black narratives? And it's really interesting to say that we battle two fronts, because we're battling the tastes of these gatekeepers inside the industry before it then reaches the commercial mainstream. So if it feels tokenistic, and I'm cough looking at this anti-racism genre that has popped up, it's because it definitely is, and it's seeing what is, you know, appealing to certain editors in certain places. And it's really important to know that each editor has their own preference, each editor has their own taste, each editor is trying to build a sort of list, so to speak. So traditions and legacies of anti-Blackness can really continue themselves in that way as well. And in terms of, I think you touched on something to do with craft and sort of the tokenization of books. It's really interesting that even really prolific commercial Black women writers, Black American writers like Yaa Gyasi, talks about the bittersweetness of having her book jump up the sales charts after another Black death has arisen. Rennie Edo-Lodge also touches about sort of this consumerism by the white gaze. These books are sort of a means of catharsis for white guilt, but what is actually being celebrated about the tangibility of the story, and also the legacy of these authors' writing. So what we kind of see is that the industry platforms these books in line with the trend, and then they disappear. Like, we don't see these 5 to 10 year legacies or these careers with legacies. And that's how we know the work is being done, when we see Black British women authors who have had successful and long lasting careers, independent of the cycles of interest that the industry pops up and then disappears with again. And just while I have the floor really quickly, a person in the audience has asked about Black, queer and trans writers and the barriers in that situation. It's also really difficult. As like someone who's queer myself, like being in industry, it's really difficult because it is sometimes like a marketing and like a sales pitch on everything. And the one thing that is a really big barrier is trying to like prove the marketability of something. So if it's a phenomenal piece of work, and it's very what they call niche, it's difficult to try and push that from an economic standpoint. They're like, well, that's great for this community, but like we're looking at the figures, we're looking at the sales, like it's not going to make this, the audience isn't there. And so we see really important legacies being shot down in the guise of like capitalistic framing, but also a lack of belief in these stories to do well commercially, to appeal outside of their own tastes. And it's so, so strange to witness firsthand, because they're like, well, I don't know this person. I'm like, but the book's not for you. Like, and Black people in industry have to do that all the time. We have to go, who would read a book about dogs? And then, you know, we take it, we roll with it, the publicity campaign starts running up, we do what we do to make the book work, but there often seems to be this pushback. And I think it is sort of residue left over or continuing to function within white and anti-Black reasoning that kind of pushes back against these new voices that are trying to make themselves seen and heard. So, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of racist residue left over in the industry and still functioning, but it's getting, I think, to a point where they're very put on a platform. I think there's a lot of guilt, a lot of we need to change. And I think galvanized by events and by the constant reports that depict how little it's changed, I think there might be a slight shift internally, but I think the real change, as always, is going to come from the Black women on the ground, carving out the spaces and commissioning and showing and demonstrating the successes of these stories, as we've done from the 1960s. So, I mean, we just continue the legacies of Black women before us.
And just thinking of, you know, you've mentioned, we've talked about intersections, and without tokenizing, it's worth acknowledging. I think I said this a few weeks back when we launched Black Issue. The Black issue doesn't mean my identity is I'm just a Black woman, end of conversation. It's so much more complex than that. There are many layers to our identities, but the truth of the matter is our Blackness a lot of the time is one of the most immediate things that people respond to when they encounter us online in the real world. And, you know, as part of this, absolutely, we should be thinking about intersections of, you know, gender, of sexuality, of disability. And I think at work, for me, we have a kind of disability working group, or rather a network that's been created. And within publishing, we also have Pride in Publishing, which is a queer group. And I think some of the groups that used to exist, the reason why I wanted to launch Black Agents and Editors group is because a lot of the groups that used to exist were quite informal, and they were events. And for me, it was, you know, Black Girls Book Club was one of these. It was places where I went and I could just be encased there for 2 hours and be in company of people who understood me. I was never part of just the one group. I went to lots of different groups and I got different things from them. I think one of the next steps for me is having a little bit more of a coalition. So I want to have more conversations with the disability group at PRH. I don't know about an industry-wide group, but I am personally in touch with people. Some of them are white women who advocate for disability and neurodivergence within publishing. And we have conversations, and I think there's definitely an opportunity to bring those two together. And yeah, to converge, and a lot of the time our needs can kind of overlap, or, you know, we can support each other and we can elevate each other's work. So yeah, I want to acknowledge that. And I want to acknowledge that for me, it's all about how you use your space to create, I guess, a wider network of allyship. And so when I see colleagues who are East Asian and they're talking about the terrible racism that Asian people are encountering in the UK, I will elevate that. I will spread the word around that. So for me, it's not a kind of exclusive thing around Blackness. I speak to Blackness because Blackness is the one way that I've consistently been defined in various countries and in various ways. Womanhood is part of that, absolutely. But for me, the two are interwoven anyways. But I think to the question of how we look at disability, how do we look at gender, I think for me, that's the way forward, to join forces and yeah, to do more together.
Thank you so much. That was just such a rich back and forth. I've got a couple of other questions, and I mean, you guys have been so great in terms of like integrating some of the kind of questions in the Q&A into the main kind of like discussion portion already. So we're kind of getting through quite a lot really nicely, but I'm going to kind of like combine two questions that I had. So you guys have all kind of like touched on it somewhat, but you know, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd last year, and then, you know, this kind of whole summer of Black rebellion, you then obviously have a very, very white publishing industry kind of like scrambling, which it was just mind-blowing to watch unfold. But then what you do have is, you know, authors of color and Black women in particular working in really kind of like interesting and critical ways to kind of, you know, actually bring to the light some of the experiences that Black authors, Black workers within the publishing industry have been experiencing. So one of the most kind of, I guess, famous parts of that ongoing discussion has been the hashtag publishing paid me, which was, that was a little bit of tea, that was a little bit of, there was so much happening in that whole kind of scenario. So the hashtag was created by Black American author L.L. McKinney to kind of basically highlight the disparities in terms of the advances and the resources that white authors are kind of given by the publishing industry versus what Black authors in particular are kind of given by the publishing industry. Folded into that, and like I said, again, you all have kind of alluded to it, publishing kind of works on this whole kind of structure of comp titles, so comparative titles. You know, you go into an acquisitions meeting and you have to prove that the book that you want to get behind will sell because someone else has written a similar book that has sold loads of copies. Obviously, for Black people who have been historically shut out of the publishing industry, if you don't have a comparison or a comparative title to show, how do you show that our work sells, even though we know the worth of our work? So I kind of just wanted to, you know, ask each of you about, I guess, you know, continuities, discontinuities, what has happened in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter and publishing paid me, if anything, what has changed, what hasn't, and how do we, I guess, refuse this demand to kind of, you know, bring stories that only cater to the white gaze to the forefront?
I would just like to kind of advocate that I don't think much has happened. I remember Melissa and I had a conversation about this and people were asking us about Black Lives Matter, and Melissa was just like, this is our lives. Like, there's always going to be an upturn, there's always going to be a discussion, there's always going to be something that happens that reminds people of the terrible injustices that Black people face. So I personally had no expectations from any type of industry, because everyone was getting dragged by their roots, whether it was law firms, makeup brands, television companies, publishing companies, and everyone was jumping on the bandwagon. It was a wild time. It was a wild time, let's just be honest. But you know, you could tell by September that the Black squares, the hashtag BLM, all of that stuff was kind of waning away. And so now, here we are now, I say coming up to a year later, and nothing really much has happened. We have seen a few more kind of anti-racist titles, but in terms of improving people's day-to-day lives who work in the publishing industry, I'm not really convinced it's made that much of a difference. We're still having awkward conversations with publishers about how to market Black women. There seems to be this kind of willful blindness or willful confusion about what to do with books that are for Black people or Black authors, or by Black authors. I would advocate that if you really want to see a consistency and a change, there really needs to be evaluation of the comparison model. And I mean, if you really want to shake the table and open up access to the publishing industry, you effectively need to abolish that model, because what you are saying is that unless someone else has published a book like this who has done very well, you cannot have a book. And if we've been categorically shut out for the last how many years, and then where you do have Black imprints and people doing the work like Jacaranda, they don't have the financial backing compared to a Bloomsbury, compared to a HarperCollins, you're always going to have a situation where continually Black authors who specifically write for Black readers are always going to be on the back foot, because their concept is always going to be seen as something that's new and exotic, and really they just need to be seen as a literary work. So I feel like until we really have a genuine reevaluation of that kind of comparison model, we will see this happening for a while. We will have breakthrough books like Queenie, Love in Colour, but I just think at the end of the day, if you really want to challenge publishing, to be original, to be supportive, to be transparent. You need to destroy that model. I get that publishing is a business and publishing is about making money. We're in a capitalist society, but I think it's intellectually false to say that the publishing industry needs that comparison model in order to kind of publish books. I just don't believe that's right, and I don't believe that's accurate anymore.
I think an interesting thing, and it came up earlier when we talk about books and we talk about publishing, is we do tend to look at fiction and we do tend to look at literary fiction. And I actually think that's not really representative of the scope of what we can do in publishing. And with fiction, you know, I always say that fiction is the most democratic, you know, side of publishing. It's the most democratic aspect of publishing, because anybody technically, if they're curious, they've been reading even from their library since they were young, they can just decide to get a notebook and start writing a book. Nonfiction, actually structurally, an issue with nonfiction is a lot of best-selling nonfiction is by academics. So it's people who need to have access to resources, to archives, to, you know, funded trips, to funded this, to funded that, to institutions, to degrees. So actually I started out in what people call serious nonfiction, and watch my fingers here. But essentially the kind of people I worked with, you know, very respected in their fields, but they were often historians from Oxbridge, and they had kind of tenure, and they, you know, they were part of an ecosystem educationally that just kind of is a very generational wealth-based sort of ecosystem. So I found it very difficult to operate within that sphere, because I thought, how am I going to get anyone different in? And I couldn't see a way. I couldn't see a way to make it happen, which is kind of part of my desire to work in a more mass market commercial nonfiction sphere. And I would say that actually for nonfiction, the really interesting thing is you do get some really high deals, but nonfiction in its very structure thrives off of comping, and not just racially. It thrives off of comping on the basis of, the great thing about working nonfiction is you have a topic. So let's say it's a gardening book, you know that there's, I don't know, you can go to YouGov and put in information, you will be told 100,000 people in London do gardening, and you'll have a bit of a figure, and it's a little bit more prompted by people's needs and a little bit less prompted by people's taste or desires. And that's something that's quite interesting about nonfiction. And because of that, I think it's a little bit more based on supply and demand than fiction. Because actually, when you think about fiction, especially literary fiction, you can have the best plot and the best writing, and people might still not pick up the book. So it's very unpredictable. So I think I want to make sure that we're looking at both of these areas of writing and publishing. So with fiction, a lot of the time, it's all about kind of the buzz around the author, the marketability. You've all spoken about. Oh my gosh, a term in publishing that is so infuriating when you break it down is, oh, this author is so marketable, which means, you know, attractive. And it comes up again and again and again. And actually, I know this is a bit of a tangent, but when you look at it, it's kind of like, well, because of the desirability of Black women and the way that we're assessed and, you know, dating politics and all of that, how are we supposed to compete, you know, with kind of your typically touted white beauty or English rose or whatever that might be. So marketability is very problematic. But yes, so within the whole ecosystem, I want to acknowledge that nonfiction does operate differently, and the advances are actually probably on the whole a bit lower, because you know exactly where the need is, and you can predict that it's going to sell about 5,000 copies based on however books have sold. And I think fiction is just it's both democratic, but very unpredictable. And something I've been reading up about is that advances generally in the last 10, 15, 20 years, book advances have just been lower. But the thing is, you hear the stories of the book advances that are phenomenal and incredible. You don't really hear about average mid-level advances of either people who are repeat serial kind of novelists or people who actually you know, sell their book for £10,000 and they still have their day job. But in terms of the overall figures, a majority of people who are published tend to keep their day jobs. We hear it with, you know, people like Toni Morrison. We hear it with Maya Angelou that they had day jobs for a long time. But I think because there are these incredible auctions, and a lot of the time the people who get the best money are white people, I will absolutely not deny that. I think people go the extra mile for white authors a lot more, is what I'm saying. Because you hear these stories, it kind of almost distracts from the fact that actually there's a lot of people who are white or are people of color or black who get very average advances. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring that in as something to consider. And we could go into academia and the problem of representation and blackness and, you know, the kind of gatekeeping of academia. But yeah, those are the kind of small nuances I want to consider when we're thinking about this.
And just to like jump in, I think it's definitely, it's interesting because I'm coming at it from a literary, and so to hear nonfiction and how comping sort of builds up the framework is really, it makes sense. Like, it's very consumer driven. You have these niche like people who are very interested in certain areas and they always buy the book by a certain author, and so if that author's name is then mentioned, they're very loyal and they then go on to purchase the new title. I think within fiction, which is sort of where I was based, I think comping is a double-edged sword. I think it definitely restricts Black British, if we just bring it back to Black British women, simply because who can we comp to here? Like, who? Because they're not taking into account the commercial success of the Black British women who've been publishing outside of traditional publishing. How could they? Because we can't, or we don't have the economic arm to push us into the stratosphere of these 7-figure book deals. And so that's why authors like Farida are really important in the legacy of sustainability and what Black women can achieve. And I think it's really important that you pointed out, Marianne, that we do have a lot of average deals. The sort of line within publishing is nobody's paid well, like it doesn't pay well. But then I think it can't be used as a guise to cover up the anti-Blackness that we are seeing trending when Black women are consistently devalued compared to our counterparts. So it's really tricky with the comps, because I mean, Queenie's comp was that, oh, it's a mashup of Bridget Jones. And so there should be, in some ways, a way that the story can transcend, in some ways, these confinements of Blackness which are restricted and placed upon authors. Oh, this is a Black book, this is a diversity book. Like, it's not every day that we're writing about the struggle. But I think definitely within industry, there's a categorization within comping that restricts these books to who has done this exactly like this before. And so I think in my head, one thing that's definitely a game changer is social media and sort of the marketability around that, because that's their favorite word. It's, oh, they're so marketable, the reach, the engagement, and they have like websites where they look up engagement rates of authors and profiles and sort of see the feasibility in terms of sales. Like, it's very, very real, and decisions of what to acquire are being based sometimes on followings. And so we see a new sort of strategy come into the play with social media. And so, I mean, when we think about the Slumflower and sort of the self-help genre, I think about 30,000 copies TCM were sold of her book, compared to 1992 when we had Soul, which was a book published by a previous foremother in the Black British women industry, and it sold like about 10,000 copies. So I think social media is it's a double-edged sword. It can be very easy, again, to jump onto trends because of the closeness within social media to be shaped around trends, and we're trying to break out of that. And I definitely think it's, in terms of like the legacy, and again, my one wish for Black British women, the authenticity and legacy of long-lasting careers within industry, I think that's definitely going to come from editors who understand the book at every stage in every department, because sometimes the book is wonderful as well, but marketing don't know what to do with it. As Melissa and Natalie said, like, they have the ideas, they know that certain people ain't turning up to Waterstones, you know, some people, like, where is the demographic, how are they responding? And I think it's very interesting that we're now getting the industry becoming self-aware with imprints like Murky Books. They know that there's sort of an infrastructure that needs to be set that knows how to authentically publish these stories. So I mean, I feel like I went on a tangent. I don't know what the original question was.
Well,
but,
I would say that to that, we at Bay, we put together 15 points. People have been calling it a publishing manifesto, but you know, with the comping and with the way that we evaluate salaries, advances and pay and things like that. So, you know, there are kind of agreed upon rates with agencies. And then in terms of the advances, we're talking about, you know, fiction, nonfiction, the differences there. I agree with you. The thing we did at Bay was we created 15 questions. It's too long for me to read them out, but I think some of the points that feel really relevant to this, actually it'll take not too long to read the short version of it. It'll take less than a minute, so I might just do that. So our 15 points initially, which then we turned to questions, were: number 1, demystify publishing; number 2, abolish nepotism; number 3, accept taste is relative; number 4, value lived experience; number 5, comp books beyond race; 6, outsource sensitivity reads; 7, create clear progression paths; 8, dismantle the BAME acronym; 9, make D and I intersectional; 10, disavow white supremacy; 11, transcend unconscious bias; 12, invest in Black audiences; 13, compensate Black authors equally; 14, respect Black experts equally; 15, stop pigeonholing Black talent. And I think the idea with that, it's in the Bookseller, we're hoping that people turn to the equivalent questions and ask themselves in their acquisition process, in the marketing and sales process, these questions. So there are steps we can take. There are things people can reflect on, not just the Black people and the Black women and the Black British women within those industries, but I think more widely, because I've seen in the kind of Q&A a few people asking, what can we do to smash the concrete ceiling for you? Please help us. But do it that way. Do it by supporting, not by centering yourself. Ask yourself honest questions and try and get out of your comfort zone and deal with the discomfort of whiteness rather than expecting us to deal with the violence of anti-Blackness. So I think those are things, if you want to get a head start and you want to kind of interrogate your own biases, I'd like to invite you to have a read. And if you want to know more about Bay, because a few people asked, it is for agents and editors within publishing, but we do some mentoring. So head on over to blackagentsandeditors.com and you'll find more information there.
Great, thank you so much for that. I know that Natalie has to kind of get going, so I'm just going to quickly just say thank you so much for joining us today. It's just been such a beautiful discussion, and it's just been great to have you here. Do you have anything else that you want to say, Natalie, before? I'm just going to ask one question from the Q&A and then we're going to wrap it all up. So
no, I have nothing to add.
You've said your piece. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thank you. All right, bye.
Bye. So the question that I want to ask, you know, there's been so many from the Q&A which are just completely fantastic, but we are kind of running out of time. It kind of wraps up or ties in nicely to a question that I wanted to ask, actually. So someone asked, what stories about Black British women would you like to see published more? Who are some of the authors that you all look up to as well?
I'll jump in here as the co-founder of Black Girls Book Club. I want to read books about Black women living their life. I want to read books about Black girls living their life simply. Someone who does good work in terms of that is Sarita Domingo, who you know that we love. She is incredible. She also is an editor. She is the editor of Who's Loving You, which is a fantastic anthology written and contributed by women of colour, including Sarah Collins and Kuchenga, who I absolutely love and adore, and Kelechi Okafor, which I'm sure a lot of you know. But yeah, I think for me, when I'm looking at reading and you know what I'm interested in, it's just Black women living their life, Black women keying. You know, I have a penchant for books which kind of focus on like Caribbean, literature, that kind of thing, and the utilization of our languages. I love that. I love picking up a book and it's kind of got patois, or anything that kind of speaks to our roots, and anything that kind of shows me that when that writer put pen to kind of pad, they weren't thinking about the white editor that was going to acquire the book. They were just writing. And I think there is something to be said. I think as Black women, we can probably tell when a writer is writing, or when a writer is writing for the white gaze. There is a difference. So I think that is what I need. That's what edifies me.
Athena.
So I am just, my wish list, God, is just Black British women writing LGBTQ narratives, because it's been too long. And so sort of the narratives that I'd like to see are more River Solomon. I know that they're American and have settled over here in the UK, but just more LGBTQ narratives. And it's really, really difficult to see sort of, I think there's starting to be a bit more awareness around marginalized identities, and not seeing them as a niche, or like only appealing to the marginalized communities that they're speaking about. But I would just love like a mainstream success on the level of Queenie, which again is not commodifying the identities in like a neoliberal way, like, oh, look at this tokenistic person, but just a love story. So in a similar way to Melissa, just like Black LGBTQ women like living. And so obviously have to do a shout out to Rebel Citizen and Jade's work. And yeah, these are the stories that I can't wait to see. And I didn't have faith before about them even making it to being acquired. I remember bumping into you in Black Girls Book Club and being like, did they take your book? No, but did they take your book? Because it so often falls short when they can't prove this wider audience that they see as necessary for commercial success. And also, I would love to have some of the foremothers make their reappearances. Jean Brinta Breeze. I would love to see, in the same way that sort of Alice Walker resurrected Zora Neale Hurston, some of the new Black British women writers coming up, resurrecting the Black British women who are out of print currently because the industry forgot their legacies. So, I mean, there's so many of them to name, and I think works like Rebel Citizen obviously pay homage to Heart of the Race and the legacies of our foremothers in this country, but definitely Black LGBTQ stuff and the older foremothers within Black British history who didn't get their moment in the sun.
Thank you so much. I think we've lost Marianne. I think her connection dropped, unfortunately. But I just want to say thank you to her as well for joining us this afternoon. So yeah, thank you both. It's just been such an incredible conversation. I've learned so much. You've probably seen my facial expressions here, just like sitting here like, whoa, like there's, even within all the conversations that we've had over the past kind of like couple of years, there's still stuff that I have to learn about this kind of like sprawling industry. So, thank you for doing that work of demystifying it. Thank you for, just that kind of those relationships of love and support and kind of like critical, sharing of resources, which is just, it will change everything. So yeah, hopefully this is the first of like many conversations that we'll have as as Black women in publishing, and I really do hope that this leads or contributes even to so much of the work that is already being done. So thank you all, and have a lovely afternoon or evening even.
Thank you.
Thank you.